As we've seen, the technique that Wright gives us for evaluating the strengths and weaknesses of arguments involves figuring out the implicit question, giving the conclusion of the argument some competition, that is, rival conclusions, other answers to the implicit question, and then ranking those rivals according to their relative plausibility. If the conclusion of the argument, which we call C1, is, in our view, the best answer to the IQ, then, in our view, that argument is labeled sound. If, in our view, C1 is not on top of the ranking by itself, then we label the argument unsound. Now, there are lots of ways an argument can fail to be sound, but there's only one way it can be sound. That is, if C1, the conclusion of the argument we're evaluating, is on top of the ranking by itself. Now, people differ about the strengths and weaknesses and the soundness and the unsoundness of arguments. That's because people have different life experiences. But what we do share are the facts of the case. So much of the work in evaluating arguments is done in figuring out how information beyond the facts of the case is relevant to that argument. One person may have certain pieces of background information in their life experiences that we don't share. And so this difference in background knowledge will account for different plausibility rankings. So let's see how that works. The conclusion of the argument, that is, the best answer to the implicit question in the mind of the author of the argument, was that the driver must have fallen asleep. Let's see if we can, given the facts of the case and our background knowledge, figure out how good that argument is. As we saw, the best implicit question in this case is something like, why are there no skid or swerve marks on the road? And the author of the argument felt that the driver fell asleep is the best answer. However, the driver could have had a heart attack, or the driver could have crashed on purpose. So we've got an IQ, we've got a couple of rival conclusions, and then we make a judgment about how well these rivals answer this implicit question, given our background knowledge. Let's say that we just can't figure out, based upon the facts of the case and our background knowledge, which of these three answers to the question, why are there no skid marks, is the best. In that case, we would label the argument unsound, because, in our opinion, the argument's conclusion, C1, is not the best, is not on top of the ranking by itself. It seems there is no best answer in this case, and so the argument whose conclusion is C1 is labeled by us unsound. Now, the work of evaluating an argument is taken up in assessing the relevance of information to that argument. And relevance is defined by Wright as impact on the rivals. So some piece of information, S question mark, as he calls it in the text, which means we don't yet know whether that information is relevant, will turn out to be relevant if it makes any impact on the rivals, that is, if it makes any of these rivals more or less plausible. If it has some discernible impact in terms of plausibility on any of these rivals, then it's called relevant. Now, it could be, for example, that we have this situation where we think that the argument whose conclusion is C1 is a pretty good argument. That is, we think it's sound because C1 is on top by itself, and we think it's strong because the gap between C1 and its closest competition is rather large. So the argument, in our view, is not only sound, but strong. Now, it may turn out that we discover some bit of information that has a small impact on what we think is a rather implausible rival. Call it C3. And this information makes C3 just a little bit less plausible. Now, that may seem insignificant, but that information is going to count as relevant to the argument since it does have a discernible negative impact on C3. So information doesn't have to have an impact on the leader of the pack, so to speak, to be relevant. It has to have an impact on any rival, any answer to the IQ that is serious enough to be on our list. So let's take some examples of different kinds of information and see how that information impacts the various rivals and in what way its relevance consists. Now, we've got 3 serious rivals. The driver fell asleep, the driver had a heart attack, and the driver committed suicide. Now, suppose we discover, in addition to the facts of the case, that the driver had a history of depression. Is that relevant? Well, most of us will say, of course. Now, in the technical sense, the reason that information is relevant is because it has an impact on our rivals. In particular, it makes the suicide rival a better answer to the IQ, and we would articulate the relevance of this information, call it S3, by describing in precise terms the impact that it has. So we would say S3 makes C3 more plausible. Now suppose we discovered that the driver had a heart condition. Most of us would say, in a common sense kind of way, well, he could have had a heart attack. Now, in a technical sense, we would say that that piece of information, that the driver had a heart condition, makes the heart attack rival more plausible. So this formulaic expression, some piece of information makes some rival more plausible or less plausible, is what Wright refers to when he asks us to articulate the relevance of some piece of information. Suppose we discovered that the driver had a healthy heart. Is that relevant? Of course. That information, that the driver had a healthy heart, has a negative impact on the heart attack rival. And articulating its relevance would go like this. S5, that the driver had a healthy heart, makes C2, the driver had a heart attack, less plausible. Suppose we discover that the driver had no history of depression. Is that relevant? Yes, that will have a negative impact on the suicide rival, and articulating the relevance of that information, call it S6, means writing S6 makes C3 less plausible. Suppose the driver had been on the road for 36 hours. Well, of course, that makes it more likely that he could have fallen asleep at the wheel, and articulating the relevance of that information would go like this. Call it S7. He was on the road for 36 hours. You'd say S7 makes C1, that the driver fell asleep, more plausible. Suppose the driver had a good night's sleep. That information would make C1 less plausible. So this is how we articulate the relevance of support. And it's important to get used to precise expression because as we continue looking at the internal workings of arguments, the different ways in which evidence can be relevant multiplies, and we've got to be able to keep those different ways separate from each other.